the serial killer investigation that just took a new turn for years. This case felt like it was going nowhere, multiple victims, similar patterns, but no suspect anyone could name.
Confront Joseph DeAngelo, the so-called Golden State Killer.
Investigators followed every lead, built timelines, tracked movements, and still, nothing held. It was the kind of investigation that slowly fades into silence, until suddenly, it didn't, because something changed, a new piece of evidence, a detail that didn't exist before, a development no one was expecting. And just like that, a case that had been stuck for years started moving again. But here's what makes this turn so unsettling. It doesn't just bring answers, it raises even bigger questions. At the start, the investigation had all the elements that usually point somewhere, multiple incidents that didn't feel random, similar patterns emerging across different locations, victims who at first glance didn't seem connected, but when placed side by side, shared just enough in common to suggest something deliberate. Investigators built profiles. They mapped timelines. They compared details across each case, looking for overlap, and slowly a theory began to take shape. This wasn't coincidence. It was consistency, the same type of approach, the same controlled behavior, the same effort to leave as little trace as possible. Whoever was responsible wasn't acting impulsively. They were following a method. That realization shifted the case into something much more serious.
He raped me. Stole my innocence, my security.
Because once a pattern is confirmed, the question changes. It's no longer what happened. It becomes who is doing this, and how long have they been doing it. Task forces were formed. Resources were expanded. Different jurisdictions began sharing information, aligning their data, trying to see the full picture instead of isolated fragments. And for a moment, it seemed like progress was being made. There were persons of interest, individuals who matched parts of the profile, people who were questioned, investigated, and examined closely, but each time, something was missing. No direct evidence, no definitive link, nothing strong enough to move forward. And that's where the investigation began to stall. Not because there was no effort, but because everything that looked promising stopped just short of confirmation. Years passed. The case remained open, but quieter.
The East Area Rapist, original Night Stalker, Eron's for short. Not a very memorable name, but he's one of the most prolific criminals California has ever seen.
Updates became less frequent. Public attention shifted elsewhere, and like many complex investigations, it settled into a state of unresolved tension. The pattern was still there, the victims were still connected, but the person responsible remained unknown, and that created a difficult reality. Because without a suspect, there's no clear direction, only possibilities. During that time, investigators continued working behind the scenes, revisiting evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, looking for anything that might have been missed. But the truth is, most of the major pieces had already been found. What they needed now was something new, something that hadn't been available before. And that's exactly what eventually emerged. Not from a witness, not from a sudden confession, but from the evidence itself. Advancements in forensic analysis had opened doors that didn't exist when the investigation first began. Techniques had improved, databases had expanded. The ability to extract and compare information had reached a level that allowed investigators to revisit old material with fresh potential, so they did. Evidence that had been collected years earlier was re-examined, not because it was wrong, but because it might now reveal more than it once could. And at first, the results were subtle, small refinements, slight improvements in clarity. Nothing that immediately changed the direction of the case. But then something different appeared, a detail that hadn't been visible before, not a complete answer, but a shift, a connection that hadn't been recognized. And once that connection was seen, it couldn't be ignored, because it didn't just add information. It changed how the existing information was understood. What once looked like separate events now aligned more tightly. What once felt uncertain now carried more weight. And most importantly, it pointed in a direction the investigation hadn't fully considered before. That's the moment every long-running case waits for, not a solution, but a turn. A point where everything that came before starts to rearrange itself into something new. And once that happens, the case is no longer standing still. It's moving again, towards something, towards someone. And this time, Investigators had a reason to believe they were closer than ever. Once the case began moving again, the shift was immediate. Investigators didn't just have new information, they had a new direction. And in complex cases like this, direction is everything. The newly uncovered detail wasn't a full answer on its own. It didn't name a suspect or close the case overnight, but it did something just as important. It narrowed the possibilities. What once felt wide and uncertain now had edges. The evidence was reorganized around this new insight. Old timelines were rebuilt. Patterns were re-examined, this time with a sharper focus. And as everything was placed back together, the connections became stronger, clearer, harder to dismiss. The same behaviors that once suggested a pattern now pointed towards something more specific. Locations that once seemed random now showed intention. Movements that had been overlooked began to carry meaning. And slowly, one idea started to take hold. The person responsible hadn't been invisible. They had been misidentified, or perhaps more accurately, not fully seen. That realization led investigators back to names that had appeared before, but hadn't stood out at the time. People who had been questioned.
Man can deal with that, knowing that he could be the reason for his family to die. And then, in his mind, no.
Briefly considered, then set aside because nothing definitive connected them to the crimes. Now, those same individuals were being looked at again, but this time with context. And context changes everything, because when you understand how a pattern works, you begin to recognize it more clearly, even in places you didn't notice before. One name, in particular, began to surface more consistently, not because of a single piece of evidence, but because of alignment. Timelian alignment, geographic alignment, behavioral alignment. Individually, none of those elements were enough, but together, they formed something stronger. Still, investigators knew better than to rush, because in a case that had already lasted years, patience was the reason they were here at all. Moving too quickly could undo everything they had just gained. So once again, they observed quickly, carefully. They looked at routines, associations, movement patterns that matched the newly understood structure of the case. And what they saw only reinforced what they had begun to suspect. The person they were focusing on wasn't acting differently now. They didn't need to, because whatever had happened had already happened, which meant the answers weren't going to come from present behavior. They were going to come from proof. The next step was critical. Investigators needed to connect the person directly to the evidence. Something that would hold up. Something that couldn't be explained away. And just like before, the answer came from something small, something that had always been there, but now carried new meaning. When that piece was finally tested against the updated understanding of the case, everything aligned: the patterns, the timelines, the behaviors. And now, finally, the evidence. At that point, there was no uncertainty left. The investigation that had once felt impossible had reached clarity. The move was made. And when it happened, it didn't feel sudden, it felt inevitable, because every step that had led there, every delay, every missed connection, every overlooked detail, had now been corrected. The truth hadn't changed. It had just been waiting to be seen the right way. For those who had followed the case for years, the development was both shocking and expected. Shocking because of who it pointed to. Expected because something about the case had always suggested that the answer was closer than it seemed. And now it was finally visible. Not hidden, not uncertain, but clear, because in the end, the case didn't just move forward, it turned. And that turn made all the difference. If this story made you realize how one new detail can completely change everything, how a case that feels stuck can suddenly come back to life, then you're starting to understand how these investigations really work. Because the truth isn't always found by adding more. Sometimes, it's found by seeing what's already there differently. So if you want more real cases, deeper breakdowns, and stories that keep evolving even when you think they're over, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who follows these stories, and subscribe to the channel, because the next turn might be even more unexpected.